The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh F52. Adapted and modified by Khushwant Singh Sandhu. Contents: 1. The Portrait of a Lady. 2. Summary 3 questions and answers 4 grammar page. 1. The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older, and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity breathing peace and contentment. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot and a reed pen, tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me. After a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. My grandmother always went to school with me, because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer. While the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus, my grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home growling and fighting each other for the chapatis we threw to them. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. That was a turning point in our friendship. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. As the years rolled by, we saw less of each other. For some time she continued to wake me up and get me ready for school. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me. I would tell her English words and little things of Western science and learning, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. This made her unhappy. She could not help me with my lessons. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school, and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures. One day I announced that we were being given music lessons. She was very disturbed. To her, music had lewd associations. It was the monopoly of harlots and beggars, and not meant for gentlefolk. She said nothing, but her silence meant disapproval. She rarely talked to me after that. When I went up to university, I was given a room of my own. The common link of friendship was snapped. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. She rarely left her spinning wheel to talk to anyone. From sunrise to sunset, She sat by her wheel spinning and reciting prayers. Only in the afternoon, she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows. While she sat in the veranda breaking the bread into little bits, hundreds of little birds collected round her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirrupings. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders. Some even sat on her head. She smiled but never shooed them away. It used to be the happiest half hour of the day for her. When I decided to go abroad for further studies, I was sure my grandmother would be upset. I would be away for 5 years, and at her age one could never tell. But my grandmother could. She was not even sentimental. She came to leave me at the railway station, but did not talk or show any emotion. Her lips moved in prayer, her mind was lost in prayer. Her fingers were busy telling the beads of her rosary. Silently she kissed my forehead, and when I left I cherished the moist imprint as perhaps the last sign of physical contact between us. But that was not so. After 5 years I came back home and was met by her at the station. She did not look a day older. She still had no time for words, and while she clasped me in her arms I could hear her reciting her prayer. Even on the first day of my arrival, her happiest moments were with her sparrows, whom she fed longer and with frivolous rebukes. In the evening a change came over her. She did not pray. She collected the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum and started to sing. For several hours she thumped the sagging skins of the dilapidated drum and sang of the homecoming of warriors. We had to persuade her to stop to avoid overstraining. That was the first time since I had known her that she did not pray. The next morning she was taken ill. It was a mild fever, and the doctor told us that it would go. But my grandmother thought differently. She told us that her end was near. She said that, since only a few hours before the close of the last chapter of her life she had omitted to pray, she was not going to waste any more time talking to us. We protested. But she ignored our protests. She lay peacefully in bed praying and telling her beads. Even before we could suspect, her lips stopped moving and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A peaceful pallor spread on her face, and we knew that she was dead. We lifted her off the bed, and as is customary, laid her on the ground and covered her with a red shroud. After a few hours of mourning, we left her alone to make arrangements for her funeral. In the evening, we went to her room with a crude stretcher to take her to be cremated. The sun was setting and had lit her room and veranda with a blaze of golden light. We stopped halfway in the courtyard. All over the veranda, and in her room right up to where she lay dead and stiff wrapped in the red shroud, thousands of sparrows sat scattered on the floor. There was no chirping. We felt sorry for the birds, and my mother fetched some bread for them. She broke it into little crumbs, the way my grandmother used to, and threw it to them. The sparrows took no notice of the bread. When we carried my grandmother's corpse off, they flew away quietly. Next morning, the sweeper swept the bread crumbs into the dust bin. Too summary. The writer recalls his grandmother as short, healthy and slightly bent. Her hairs were silver in color and were scattered messily on her wrinkled face. She used to walk around the whole house in white clothes. She kept her one hand resting on her waist, and the other hand was telling the beads of her rosary. The writer thinks of her as not very pretty, but constantly beautiful all the time. He compares her calm face with the winter landscape. During their lengthy stay in the village, grandmother woke him up from the bed in the early morning, plastered his wooden slate, organized his breakfast and sent him to the school. The temple was connected to the school. She sat inside and studied the sacred texts while the children learned the alphabet. On their way back to the home, she used to give the stale chapatis to the street dogs. A turning point in their beautiful relationship arrived when they went to live in a city. Despite the fact that they shared a room, their relationship started to grow apart. Now the writer used to go to the city school on a school bus and studied subjects like English, physics, mathematics, and many more subjects that his grandmother could not understand at all. His grandmother could no longer go to school with him to send him. She felt upset that there was no teaching about God and scriptures at the city school. Instead, he was given music lessons, but she said nothing. She thought music was dreadful. It was just good for prostitutes and beggars, according to her. It was not intended for gentlemen. When the writer went to a university, he got a separate room in his house. The common link of the relationship between the grandson and the grandmother was broken now. Grandmother rarely talked to anyone in the house now. The writer's grandmother quietly accepted her loneliness. She was constantly occupied with her spinning wheel and reciting prayers, and she hardly ever spoke to anyone. She took a break in the afternoon. Her daily routine consisted of breaking bread into pieces and giving it to the birds. The birds would perch on her legs, head, and even her shoulders. When the writer was leaving on a trip abroad for his further studies, his grandmother did not get disturbed at all. Rather, she went to the train station to say goodbye, but she didn't say anything and merely kissed his forehead. Her lips were moving in prayer, her thoughts were consumed by prayer, and her fingers were busy reciting the story of the beads on her rosary. Seeing her grandmother at this old age, the writer was thinking that it might be his last meeting with his grandmother. But when he came back home after a duration of 5 years, his grandmother was there to welcome him back, and he saw her celebrate his return. The next morning after the return of his grandson, she got ill. Although the doctor told them that it was a slight fever and would go away very soon, still she could foresee that her time to leave this world was near. She did not want to waste her time talking to someone. Her fingers were busy reciting the story of the beads on her rosary. She went to her bed praying and telling the beads till her lips stopped moving and the rosary fell down from her lifeless hand. Her body was discovered on the floor, wrapped in a red shawl after she died. To grieve her death, thousands of sparrows flew in and sat dispersed around her body. All the sparrows flew away without making any noise or pecking any bits of food scattered for them when the dead body of the old lady was carried away for the last rites. 3 questions and answers. Question 1. Mention 3 reasons why the author's grandma was upset when he began attending a city school. Answer. The grandmother was bothered by the following. 1. She was no longer able to assist him in his studies. He began attending an English medium school, where he was taught topics such as English, physics, and maths. She could not understand these. This all upset Sir. 2. There were no lessons on God or religion. 3. She didn't like the fact that he was taking music lessons. Music, she said, was just for beggars or other level activities. Question 2. What would the author's grandmother do after he grew up and started studying at the university? Answer. His grandmother has changed dramatically since he was a child. She grew increasingly private. She'd spend her days at the spinning wheel, praying and feeding sparrows. Question 3. The 3 phases of the author's relationship with his grandmother before I left else country to study abroad. Answer. The 3 phases of the author's relationship with his grandmother before he left the country to study abroad are: 1. Childhood, when he went to the village school and the grandmother helped him to get ready and went to school with him. 2. Boyhood, when he went to the city school in a bus. He shared a room with grandmother, but she could no longer help him in his studies. 3. Early youth, when he went to the university and was given a room of his own. The common link of friendship was broken. Question 4. 3 ways in which the author's grandmother spent her days after he grew up. Answer. The 3 ways in which the author's grandmother spent her days after he grew up are: 1. She lived alone in her room as she had accepted her loneliness quietly. 2. She sat at her spinning wheel reciting prayers. 3. In the afternoon she would feed the sparrows. Question 5. The odd ways in which the author's grandmother behaved just before she died. Answer. Just before her death, the author's grandmother refused to talk to them. Since she had omitted to pray the previous night while she was singing songs of homecoming and beating the drum, she was not going to waste any more time. She ignored their protests. She lay peacefully in bed praying and telling beads. Question 6. The way in which the sparrows expressed their sorrow when the author's grandmother died. Answer. Thousands of sparrows sat silently surrounding the dead body of the author's grandmother. There was no chirruping. The author's mother threw some crumbs of bread to them. They took no notice of them. As soon as the grandmother's corpse was carried off, they flew away quietly. Thus the sparrows expressed their sorrow. 4 grammar page.